Catch up with the member for Kingsford Smith, the Labor MP, Matt Thistlethwaite. Thanks for joining us, Matt. Did you have fun in the caucus meeting this morning?
G'day, Chris. It was a great caucus meeting for the Labor Party. A lot of policy issues discussed, unlike the government, which are still divided over their energy legislation. They've been 6 years in government now and they still don't have an energy policy. Now, I understand it was a pretty interesting meeting in the Coalition Party room this morning about their proposed legislation.
They're fumbling around trying to get power prices down and all the rest of it. They're in government. They've got to deal with that. But when it comes to energy policy, you've got a bit of division in your own side, haven't you? What's your emissions target going to be? It seems that Penny Wong and others want to stick with the 45% emissions reduction target. Others say, forget it, just bail out and join the government in pursuing the Paris targets. What's it going to be?
Well, Chris, like every election, Labor reviews its policies in the wake of that, and this one is no different. We're conducting a thorough review of not just our energy and emissions policy, but all of our policies, and we'll take our time to consult with the Australian public. But the principles upon which we've founded our policy of stronger action on climate change, making sure that we have a future to hand on to our kids, ensuring that we're boosting renewables into the system and reducing energy prices. Our policy will be based on those principles, of course, as well as meeting our international commitments that the country signed up to at Paris. So we'll take our time, we'll consult, and we'll release our policy before the next election.
Let's just clarify a couple of points on that. If you're saying you want to do more on climate change, does that mean that no matter what Labor does, its emissions reductions targets will be higher than the Paris targets Australia has already committed to?
Well, we know now, Chris, that at the moment emissions in Australia are increasing again. When Labor was previously in government, they were falling. We were meeting all of our international commitments.
That's a fair criticism of where the government is now, but we know what their target is, and they have to meet their target. And as you say, perhaps they're not on track to do that now, but that's a separate discussion. What will Labor's target be? Are you saying it has to be higher than the Paris targets?
No, I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying that Labor will commit to the international agreements that the country has signed up to.
But you were saying, Matt Thistlethwaite, that Labor will do more on climate change. Well, to do more on climate change, then you have to have an emissions target, an emissions reduction target that is higher than the current Paris commitment.
What I'm saying, Chris, is we'll do more than the current government. We know that...
Well, that means more than the Paris target. Emissions... Unless you set a target that is higher than Paris, then you are not promising to do more on climate than the government.
Well, we had a stronger policy than the government at the last election within that framework. We know that emissions are increasing again, and we know that there's deep concern within the Australian community about the effects of climate change. It's an issue that's top of mind for people in my electorate. They want to know that the future that their kids will inherit will involve higher living standards, not reductions in living standards, to know that their kids will be able to get insurance into the future because of the risks of climate change, and that they just inherit a safer and cleaner world. And at the moment, there's deep concern about that in the Australian community. I
understand all that, and that's a very pertinent political pitch. But the simple fact is here, Matt Thistlethwaite, is that if Labor are going to say that they will do more on climate change than the government, then it is a matter of inescapable logic that you have to have a carbon emissions reduction target greater than the Paris target.
No, that's not the case at all, Chris, and we saw that at the last election.
Well, hang on a second. Let me just interrupt. Let me just interrupt. The only way that Australia can contribute to global efforts on climate change is by reducing its carbon emissions. So if you are saying that Labor will always do more on climate change than the government, you have to say that Labor will have a higher emissions reductions target than the Paris target that the government's already signed up to.
No, that's not the case at all, Chris.
Well, then you're not saying you're doing more on climate.
Well, Labor's committed to the international agreements that Australia has signed up to, and that is to the world's come together and recognised that we need to limit global warming to a 2-degree scenario. And the policy that we took to the last election fit within that framework. Now, we're conducting a review of that policy and the targets that were set through that policy. We'll take our time, we'll consult with the Australian public, and we'll make sure that we have a policy that is in Australia's best interests, that overall reduces emissions, ensures that we meet our international commitments, but more importantly, ensures that electricity prices are reduced because, as I said earlier, we've had 6 years of this government now and they still don't have an energy policy. You've had this war on climate going on within the government that has affected Australian households to the extent that many pensioners can't afford to switch on their heaters during the winter or turn their air conditioners on during the summer because they can't afford the electricity bills. That's because of the uncertainty that's been created by this government.
Sure, Matt Thistlethwaite, the government can be criticised, and let's grant that you can come up with new climate and energy policies that are smarter, cleaner, cheaper, quicker, all of that. But the bottom line here is the inescapable logic, isn't it? And that is, if you're saying that Labor is going to do more on climate change than the Coalition, then you have to have an Australian emissions reduction target that is greater than the current one.
No, I don't accept that at all, Chris. We will operate within the framework of Australia's international commitments. Well, I'll give you an example, Chris.
I'm staggered that you could challenge the inescapable logic of that conclusion. Unless you promise to cut our emissions more, then you cannot say that you're doing more on climate change.
Well, at the last election, Labor had a difference in policy compared to the government around things like support for electric vehicles and ensuring that there was enough infrastructure for electric vehicles that are increasing in prevalence in the Australian community. That's something that a policy that Labor took to the last election that was stronger than the government's, that was different, that operated within that framework. So it's entirely reasonable that Labor can have a policy of meeting our international commitments but take stronger action than the government on climate change. And that was what we're proposing at the last election. Now, we're reviewing all those policies. I accept that. Yeah, but that's how it can be achieved.
But you're going around in circles, because I can concede that point. Let's say that you've got the most wonderful electric car policy in the planet and everybody loves it and we all get cheap electric cars, yada, yada, yada. The point is, though, unless you reduce Australia's carbon dioxide emissions by a greater amount than the Coalition, then you are not doing more on climate. So, presumably, you are saying that you must have a higher target than the Coalition, than Paris.
Well, there are plenty of scientists and economists that believe that the government isn't going to meet the commitments that we've signed up to internationally. And Labor was proposing to put in place a policy that would ensure that we met those commitments. And that was what we were proposing at the last election. Now, we didn't win the last election. We accept that. That's why we're conducting this review, not just of our energy policy, Chris, but of all of our policies. And we've got Craig Emerson and Jay Weatherall chairing that policy review. In the coming weeks, they'll release a report where we'll look at some of these policies, and then we'll begin consultations with the Australian public to put in place a policy that is based on those principles that I mentioned earlier, but it overwhelmingly is in Australia's best interests.
One final time. I didn't really want to chew up all this time. I wanted to talk to you about some other issues, Matt Thistlethwaite, but you are saying that Labor will always do more on climate than the Coalition. Do you not accept that that means you have to commit to a higher emissions reduction target than the Coalition?
No, I don't accept that at all in terms of the international commitments that we've signed up to. And a good example, Chris, is that Labor in government established mechanisms that assist our economy to reduce our emissions and to transfer our energy mix to a renewables future. And examples of that are the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, the Australian Renewable Energy Agency. There are clear differences in policy that ensure that Labor has a stronger policy when it comes to climate change. Now, both of those bodies are doing the jobs for which they are intended and established and encouraging the uptake and the financing of renewable energy within our economy. It's a classic example of Labor being stronger within that framework of the Paris Agreement.